Hey gang, before the video starts, two really quick notes. First of all, this video was recorded well before the marathon situation, shall we say. So there is a moment in the video where I mentioned some other things that might limit the factors around how well Bungie is doing, generally speaking, and some things that people might want to point out as general reasons not to engage with their products. Assume the plagiarism story is a part of that. It's just because, well, yeah, I don't have foresight. I didn't know it was going to happen, so yeah, I didn't include it in the video. Secondly, some of you have been asking, no, I was not one of the people that was invited to Bungie, but I think that's also for a very good reason because, well, I cover story stuff, and I imagine that anything I would have wanted to cover from the game would have been immediately part of an NDA and would have been considered spoilers. So no, I will not have content for you on June 3rd like everyone else. That being said, I'm jazzed that everybody got invited out. I'm jazzed that people seem to have, so far, got some decent impressions of it. And I'm excited to see what they have seen. Anyway, all that being said, enjoy the video. Greetings, Guardians. My name is Bife here. So Edge of Fate's reveal was chock full of details, but there are a few things I wanted to focus on regarding how Edge of Fate is changing Destiny in the long term and might be approaching the general health of the game as a whole. Obviously, there are a bunch of details on how the game is evolving its core systems, but I don't want to touch on the portal or the new armor or the refreshed weapons or anything else in between. Today I wanted to do what I do, which is to talk about the core issues within Destiny's story. As it stands, I think that they were addressed in the reveal, but the degree to which those fixes are going to actually help the core game is variable. Whilst it was definitely a very candid stream, I feel like I'm in that camp of people who prefer vidocs. There's something much more focused and bullet pointy about it. That being said, maybe there's a combination we could do of the two. Vidocs to start, and then afterwards we have something of a more candid, explanatory thing that goes on for longer and goes into more detail. Either way, that's a side point, and again, we need to see how the situations and issues within Destiny's narrative are being addressed, and then we should take a look at how those different solutions that Bungie's come up with will be actually addressing what ails Destiny. We can't tell what their efficacy is going to be like right now, but we can at least start to see the road that we'll all be walking. So, let's start at the top. What are the issues with Destiny's narrative right now? I think realistically, and this is perhaps just my perspective, it breaks down to these three core issues. 1. Destiny's Light and Dark saga ended, and a new one needs to start. A little addendum to this is simply that any new saga needs a good hook for veteran and new players alike to start their journey again in this new saga. That hook has to be clear from the beginning. 2. Destiny's world feels solved. This is basically stating that here at the end of the Light and Dark saga, we've overwhelmingly moved from a world of mystery that presents questions to a world that is known thanks to those questions having been answered. Addressing that balance is the core of solving this problem. And 3. Destiny's story feels too routine. This is much more of a problem with a typical seasonal story than it is with perhaps some of the campaigns that arrive with every expansion. But Destiny's story, in these seasonal beats particularly, has fallen too consistently into a well-understood delivery formula. In seasonal stories, this has been a result of the seasonal stories unfolding week by week with relatively predictable narrative pacing. You can almost predict when the conflict is going to happen. You can sit there and understand where things will turn based on the narrative that is being fed to you week by week. For expansions, the problem is a lot more complicated, and I don't know if there is one single diagnosis, but I think it's worth accepting that there is a two-tone note to this conversation. Seasons are going, and expansions will be the new point of friction whenever players want to express their dissatisfaction with the story. However, I feel like Destiny's story feeling too routine will still be a death knell. This is a moment where routine in this instance might simply lead us to say mundane or boring. If an expansion doesn't take a risk and doesn't do interesting things with its narrative, I think that's a bigger problem than anything right now. In my opinion, these are the biggest issues addressing the way that narrative content is presented in Destiny. There are bigger things that need to be noted, across the entire studio generally and across the entire game. Things that go beyond the narrative department. Sunsetting content that people paid for, layoffs, Pete Parsons' abysmal reputation and how it has soured player reception, the poor reception of the Lightfall expansion, and how it still does reputational damage. These are worth mentioning because they don't necessarily define the narrative's issues, but they are bigger picture issues that stop players from engaging with the game generally, or that drove them away and have allowed them to sit there and say, no, until these are fixed, I won't come back. I don't think these issues need to be expanded upon much, although I will touch on them occasionally in this video, but it's clear that these issues are either putting people off at the time and damage the game's reputation, or they continue to plague the game and make it off-putting for people to return. I think they're worth mentioning here and now, because inevitably there will be someone in the comments who wants to point out that these issues exist, and to be really clear, yeah, this stuff matters. But there are 3 points here that are specific to the narrative, and that's what I want to focus on. I know we'd all happily pick up our pitchforks and go after Pete Parsons in his many, many cars, but I want to focus on the story and how it's being addressed within Edge of Fate. So, we're going to mostly keep that frame of focus. To get back to that point of focus, you might not necessarily agree with my perspective, but those are the 3 core issues with the story that I perceive. How is Bungie going to address these issues? Let's start at the top. Point number 1. Destiny's Light and Dark saga is over and a new saga has to begin. This problem was always going to be at the heart of it all. It's the MCU problem, as I'm sure many people have called it. You killed Thanos, now what? Bungie now appears to have their answer to this. Bungie revealed that their new saga is going to be called The Fate Saga. This was all done within the Edge of Fate livestream, and they also announced that Edge of Fate was the first of 4 expansions that we'll be getting in that saga, which in itself is meant to unpack over several years. So, here are some important points to know about this. The thing that was really glossed over by the community, I think, is that Robbie Stevens on the couch explicitly said that the team knows where the new Fate saga was going. My biggest observation here is that because of that statement, this feels as though it is distinctly different from Destiny's Light and Dark saga in retrospect. And why? Well, it's all about the fact that they kind of know the direction and therefore they're not just driving the car because the car needs to be driven. At points in time, the darkness was definitively not a part of the Light and Dark saga. For the first several years of it, we didn't know that the Light and Dark saga was even called the Light and Dark saga. The Witness clearly wasn't a thing that was conceived of from the start, although there were definitely narrative hints within the lore that laid the groundwork for the possibility of it existing. There were whole stories, such as Destiny 1's story, before it was released that were rewritten in the middle of their development. Whilst there's a lot of speculation around it, there is also still a large contingent of the community that prescribes to the idea that Lightfall and The Final Shape were meant to be one expansion before a push was made to split them into 2 to create another year of seasonal content. To put it really bluntly, whilst expansions can be excellent in isolation, the Light and Dark saga sort of meandered to its conclusion and was not focused at all. There was an idea of where things were going to end eventually, but that didn't materialize for a long, long time. I think it took until Shadowkeep for them to realize the vague direction that they wanted to take the saga, and I think that other ideas definitely percolated down into the narrative as time went on. But it seems very clear that from the beginning of the 10-year journey, the vision was not the same, and it was not a single founded set of principles where Bungie would be able to sit there and say, we know exactly where this narrative is going. With what Robbie Stevens said at the top, it seems clear that Bungie has built out the narrative framework for the world, for the Fate saga, and for where it's all going to go. This doesn't mean that they know exactly who's going to die, or what words are going to be said when, or the exact moments at which certain characters will have tipping points within their narrative arcs. However, it does mean that they understand the final goal of this, the final vision, and they know from the beginning what the broad brush strokes are. I think people underestimate how important planning like that really is. This is paired with the quiet announcement of not just a couple of expansions, but a whole 4 of them representing the first 2 years worth of content in the Fate saga, which is meant to last again for several years. That announcement of a bunch of content matters because I think it represents a bit of a confidence thing. When Bungie knows where the story is going, and when Bungie has a vague idea of what's going to go on in the future of their franchise, it means they know what's going to be next in the driving seat, and it means that the story feels focused, and that the entire saga feels consistent. Narrative consistency is something that Destiny has been sorely lacking for the first half of its 10-year journey, and something that might hopefully be brought to the forefront as time goes on. But it's more than just that when I say that it's a confidence thing, because I think players were sticking with Destiny long before that. Destiny's first saga lasted so long, partly because players stuck with it, and partly because they promised that it would be a 10-year journey. The idea of a 10-year journey might have been something that evolved and meandered a little bit for Bungie over the last decade or so, but for players who were bolted on, it became a strangely ironclad promise. We expected 10 years of content, 10 years of continuity, 10 years of a universe to invest ourselves in. We knew that we were here for that decade, and that gave the game a degree of staying power in people's minds that so many other franchises just didn't get. There was no 10-year journey for Anthem, or The Division 2, or Borderlands. I mention those three because it shows the range of failure to success across the looter genre, from hard AAA flops to iconic IPs that persist and succeed to this day, but none of them really lived up to the continuous idea of a 10-year narrative journey. In some cases, like Borderlands, it's fair to say that they weren't trying to. Each Borderlands game is contained and is its own thing, and the devs work on it until it's done. To their credit, it's absolutely worked, but in some cases like Anthem, well, there was definitely the promise of at least competing with Destiny, but the 10-year journey never manifested because, well, yeah, let's not get into that mess actually. The wider point remains. Players kept coming back for the 10-year narrative journey that Destiny had promised, and so here, when that narrative journey has ended, Bungie has now stated that they have a new saga, and they've promised a story off the bat that runs for several years that is already plotted out to its logical narrative endpoint, and which already has 2 years of content announced for it. I think it's all chasing the same confidence and the same goal of continuity. It's not as loud and confident as it was back in the days of 2014, but I don't think it's possible to do that anymore. Some things are missing, the same levels of hype that existed before the Light and Dark saga were released and at its pinnacle moments when it was at its greatest, the proof of whether the story is good or not, and of course, well, this screenshot right here. I keep on going back to this moment, this screenshot. As a Destiny veteran, I can't help it. It's seared into my brain, basically forever. I went back recently and I rewatched some of the old Destiny 1 trailers just to understand the context for this video. And you know what? There is something different about them. I think it's partly because I remember what the state of Bungie and the community for Destiny was like back then, and I remember what their status within the gaming community was like as well. They had successfully created one of the greatest franchises in the history of gaming and passed it off to Microsoft to win their independence. The shadow of that IP still looms large in Microsoft's catalog, even as the last decade of Halo games haven't met the same bar of fan expectations. We were also in a younger, more ignorant time, when we were less vocal about things that made us furious, and where controversies hadn't been uncovered yet. We had only the promise of greatness, unbridled hope of what could come next, and no reason to doubt that it would indeed live up to those promises. We may never be able to recapture some of the magic that I remember from the beginning days of Destiny 1's pre-release marketing, or perhaps maybe we shouldn't. The crushing reality of what Destiny 1 was broke down so quickly, and the tone shifted with a speed that makes the term whiplash blush. But I think deep down, all of this sentiment, all of this feeling that was engendered by the early marketing of Destiny still succeeded, and you can tell because I think players stuck around. And a big part of that marketing was that there was a 10-year journey, and with that came the realization. We have 10 years to stick with this franchise, and we can see its potential, its greatness, the things that we were promised, and if we only dig just a little bit deeper, we can discover that greatness. And you know what? I think that we have. It's one of those moments where I sit there and I remember that there's many people who doubt, but whenever I think of the return of Saint 14, or of the Witch Queen expansion, or of Final Shape's delivery on the perfect arc that ends the story of the Vanguard, the way that Prince Uldren went from snarky arch-nemesis all the way to being one of our closest allies as a reborn guardian in the form of Crow, the perfect little moments in the writing of the lore, and everything to do with Eris frickin' Morn, god damn. Yeah, I think we've unearthed the greatness that Destiny has. I think that that promise was fulfilled. Bungie have learned a lot of lessons in the decade since the reveal of the Pathways Out of Darkness vidoc, and things have been both lost and gained. I think that Destiny's development team will be able to take those lessons and reflect on them. The fact that they're able to do this now, as they're beginning their new saga, and to make systematic changes that will smooth out the entire thing, will pay dividends for them in the future. Confidence in the future of Destiny was something that had to be projected from the beginning for it to stick around and to be successful. I think that Bungie has learned that lesson when starting this new saga and revealing that there are indeed 4 expansions to it already planned, and that everything else has a clear roadmap for where it's going internally. That being said, I feel like the style of presenting is what's making a big difference here. Again, I feel like I'm in that vidoc camp as opposed to the one that sits down and prefers the more candid, less grandiose manner that is presented on these new reveal streams. But as I said from the very beginning when I mentioned this first point, this new saga needs something. I've called it a hook for lack of better words. In the beginning, this was represented by Destiny's mysterious world and the promise of adventure. That was what pulled us all in the first place. Some of that can still be recaptured, but I don't think it can be the central thing that pulls people back in anymore. I think perhaps calling the saga the Fate Saga is an attempt to do this though, as is the promise that the revelations at the end of the Edge of Fate expansion will be the catalyst for everything that comes next. But in its entirety, I think that there still needs to be a hook, something that compels veteran players to remember the world they built and defended together, and to be something that creates intrigue for new players who might also want to jump in. For the former, aka veteran players, I think I can still speak to this notion and state that, yeah, something is still probably missing from this. For the latter, aka new players, I think you'd be better served with the less jaded and fresher perspective of someone like Milo, aka Mr. Roffle Waffles, who recently started creating content and covering what Bungie is making with Destiny and Marathon. He's looking at all of this with the fresh set of eyes of somebody who is able to sit there and wonder at the massive amount of content that's been made over the last half-decade that's still in the game. I've seen it stated that the new saga requires a villain, which I don't think is necessarily wrong. I've seen it stated that the new saga requires new forces of the universe beyond light and darkness, which I think Bungie is working on. I've seen it stated that the narrative needs to focus on why we should be returning. Again, I don't think I necessarily disagree, but that's also not big enough of a point to give feedback on. Regardless, it seems like some of this is a little unproven, but the foundations for starting a new saga are there. We just need to see how they are developed, and if they develop well, and if players attach to this new model. I think it's also fair to say that, at least from the very beginning, Bungie knows how to treat this better than they did back in the days of Destiny 1, because they understand more intimately what they're making now. This new saga is something that doesn't have the same hype as Destiny 1's initial release window, but it is something that holds with it the promise of a more experienced Bungie. And I think it's also fair to sit there and say that the Bungie of 10 years ago that created Destiny 1 made something of a terrible skeleton for the first saga. It wasn't a skeleton at all, more of a suggestion. If the saga is being fully planned out from the beginning, I actually have a lot more confidence in the idea that it's going somewhere. The one thing I wish Bungie would do is shout this louder and be more focused about it. Say this is the number of years the Fate saga is slated to last for. Say this is how many expansions we want. Announce it proudly. Show off those first 4 expansions that have been announced with pride, and say these are the journeys we want to go on. Demonstrate that there is indeed a vision for the future of this game, and players will return to it. Because if you give them a universe to defend, players will find their purpose again, I feel. Point 2. World of Destiny feels solved. So, what do I mean by this? Well, let's start by meandering away from the question a little bit whilst actually walking towards the heart of it. A good question is the heart of any good story. It doesn't need to be something as mind-bending and conceptually dense as what is the difference between dreams and reality, or what is the true nature of fate. But I think we all know a good question when we see it. If you see someone called Crota, the son of Oryx, your immediate question is, who is Oryx? Followed possibly by, what has he done? Or maybe, will I fight him too? As it turns out, the answer to those questions represent the basis of not just one of the holy grails of Destiny's lore in the Books of Sorrow, and not just one of its most respected expansions in the form of the Taken King, but also one of its most revered raids in the form of King's Fall. Questions at the heart of expansions are something that I feel drive the story, and questions within the lore can drive us to interesting places in narratives generally too. I mean, just take a listen. Who is Saint 14 and why do I have his helmet? Who is Osiris and why is he referred to as an exile? Who are the Iron Lords and why are there only one or two of them left? Do we have to make war with the Fallen forever, or can we potentially become allies with them? Who is the Witch Queen and how did she steal the light? What is the final shape and how did we stop it? Destiny is a universe that was filled with hundreds of questions. Some of them went as far back as Destiny 1 Vanilla. Some of them were developed over time, and some of them were so potent that whole expansions cropped up around them. Some of them weren't great. Curse of Osiris is not remembered fondly. Some of them, though, are some of the most celebrated in its history. Again, Taken King and Witch Queen, they all develop from questions. How did Savathun steal the light? And if Crota is the son of Oryx, who's Oryx? I've always had this sense that if you were especially tuned in or even half paying attention to the things that you'd been interacting with, you would start to see a potential flow of where the story was leading in Destiny, because the questions in its lore would simply get louder and louder until eventually, boom, Witch Queen happens. Or boom, Season of Dawn is revealed, and we brought back Saint 14. Or boom, Season of the Splicer is revealed, and we get our first true Eliksni ally in the form of Mithrax. The lore built these questions, and the process of answering them gave us some of the greatest expansions and seasonal narratives we've ever received. But as Destiny's rich storytelling landscape was developed over time, and as the Light and Dark saga drew to a close, we started to see more answers and fewer questions. Where before, there was a sense that the world of Destiny was loaded with potential, each subsequent expansion unpacked the potential that was there, but unfortunately it wasn't replaced with new questions. At the conclusion of the Light and Dark saga, I think it was right that the focus was on the nature of the answer to some primary questions. What is the final shape? What is the witness? Can we defeat it? Is it right for us to fully put faith in the Traveler? And how did Cayde get back to us? All of these questions were addressed and most of them were answered in the process of the Final Shape campaign, and it felt like those answers delivered. At least I think they were if you weren't skipping the damn cutscenes and dialogue, but if you're doing that and still complaining about there being no story, there's a lovely garden rake over there I'd love you to go ahead and check out and walk over to. Just step on it, you'll find out what I mean. But beyond the Final Shape, we're now left in a universe where those big questions were answered, and things in its wake feel listless, lacking in direction, solved. Guardians had a purpose in this universe, defeating the Witness and saving the Lost City. We still do have a purpose. That same purpose has not changed. It's hard to believe that the purpose of defeating the Witness will ever be surpassed in the immediate aftermath of its defeat, though. Especially because, well, we saved the universe. What possibly could come next? So what do you do and how do you engender new purpose within a universe that suddenly feels as though it's solved? Well, I think this is where questions can help. And to their credit, this is something that Robbie Stevens and Alison Luhrs both called out in the reveal. Alison stated that, "We want to ask questions about our home that we've never asked before regarding the focus of the Nine in Edge of Fate." Robbie Stevens put it more broadly with a couple of quotes, saying, "The conclusion to the Edge of Fate is going to leave you with more questions than answer, and it's going to be the catalyst for the Fate saga." More pressingly, he stated that, "We want to return Destiny to being a game about big questions. The way we think about this is about pouring jet fuel into the speculation engine of the game." And finally, we're going to be revealing a lot of ideas and a lot of concepts, and many of them we're not going to be answering immediately, because we're going to be telling this story over multiple expansions, and we're going to be giving those expansion beats more times than we have before in the past. This is a direct antidote to what I'm talking about. Expansions are being led by questions, and they're expanding the universe of Destiny in the process. As the saga draws to a close, those core questions will be answered, but also, the questions and the focus of them as the universe of Destiny's primary catalyst for story is the heart of what made Destiny 1 so excellent. And I mean, I think you can already see this in action. I don't think this is just talk. I say that because, well, look at the conclusion of Heresy's story. Spoilers ahead for anyone who's not played it, but by the conclusion of Heresy, we have new questions. Who is the Lord of Every Nothing? What is Savathun going to do next now that she's named us as her enemy for real? What do the Hive do now that they once again doubt the sword logic as an ironclad way of being? Will Xivu Arath stay the course, or will she change in the face of her entire life, basically being upended and being shown as a lie? What does all this mean for the future of the Cabal and the inevitable war to retake Torobatl? What is the future of the Taken and the Dread? There are questions being asked in Heresy, and I think it represents a change in a way that even something as recent as Revenant didn't. Revenant was an episode that was still fundamentally about answers instead of about answers and creating new questions. Sure, there are technically some questions in there. The fate of Aramis, the potential future of Reese, and the future of the Echo that's in Aramis's possession are all core to it, but the answers still felt like the focus. Will Crow be able to set his past to rest? What's going to happen to Fikrul and the Scorn? Can Aramis be redeemed? Will Mithrax survive his Nezarec-based affliction? And of course, how will the prophecy of the Kell of Kells be resolved? I personally didn't like the answer to a bunch of these questions, but that's beside the point, which is that these aren't questions that make us ask a whole lot more about the universe and present new possible story threads. They are answers that tie up existing story threads. Given what they've said and what they've already shown with Heresy, I have some confidence that this aspect of discovery will return to Destiny, and the universe that was propped up by the massive questions laid out in the lore will return to form. It can never be the same as it was 10 years ago, but that's for better and for worse. Destiny was always going to evolve and change. That's the nature of a thing being alive for 10 years and being worked on continuously for that amount of time. But it does mean that there's still the potential for greatness. Just because it wasn't like what the past was, doesn't mean that we need to be shackled to that nostalgia. If Destiny's 10-year saga had a significant amount of its ground laid by the works of Seth Dickinson and the Books of Sorrow, then I can't wait to see what the next iteration of that is, when the team is focused and is aware that they want to create moments that invoke that same sense of mystery in our universe again. Now, let's be clear, I'm not expecting a 52-entry lore book with tales that define a perspective of one kingdom's rise to prominence across bloody stars in its wake, but I am expecting new questions to arise and new mysteries to evolve. As with the first point, we'll have to wait and see, but unlike with the first point, I feel a lot more confident about the idea that this one is going to be answered. Whilst Destiny's new saga requiring a hook and needing to carry on from where the old saga ended is definitely a problem, and whilst that is something we will need to see proof in the pudding of when we get to the expansion, I think we can start to see the changes in Destiny feeling solved right now. There are new questions in the game already as of the end of Heresy, and if the Nine are as mysterious as they've always seemingly been, then I think that's bound to be the course we follow for the next few years, and that's a very good direction for Bungie to be pushing the game in right now. Point number 3. Destiny's story feels too routine. Finally, we need to talk about structure, rigidity, predictability, monotony. These are the things that have plagued the seasonal content of Destiny and have made it substantially worse over the years. But I think we should acknowledge that underneath all of that, this is really a two-beat conversation. One side of the conversation covers what I just mentioned, aka the seasonal content and how its delivery has grown stale. The other note is about to become even more important though, and it's to do with how Destiny's expansions tell stories and how they now represent the primary friction point in this discussion. I've already covered it to death, but one more time, just for good measure, Destiny's seasonal content model was a credit to its longevity, because it allowed Bungie to create more content regularly and at a reasonable pace. There was clearly always a consistent workflow within the studio that ensured that we weren't in a prolonged content drought. However, from this consistency arose a new problem. The problem ended up being that the seasons became recognizable to the point of tedium within their own structures. Stories always had this seasonal MacGuffin that you would unlock over time. Stories always had the same pacing, with big cutscenes at the start, weeks 4 or 5, and at the very end. Conflict was alluded to, started, and then concluded within those same 8-week spans. Every week there was a new mission, and towards the tail end of things those missions became same-ish and monotonous. Every week there was the tiny unraveling of something more. In the end, the pace of the story became so recognizable that I think players grew into it to the point of becoming bored. So with all that being said, how has this changed? What's different in the Edge of Fate and the Fate saga going forward? Well, structurally we can already see an actual genuinely huge change. Seasons are gone, they are dead, put to rest. They're soon to be replaced with 2 free updates per year at 6-month intervals, which are targeted to be akin to the Into the Light update that launched before Final Shape. This is of course in addition to the 2 expansions per year, which were meant to be something larger than Rise of Iron but smaller than a typical expansion like Witch Queen. Updates and expansions are typically about 3 months apart from each other by the looks of things, creating something that is similar in terms of the seasonal delivery that we've come to expect. The actual structure of what's being delivered appears to be completely unrecognizable. In the process of making 2 expansions per year, each slightly larger than Rise of Iron, Bungie is creating a main narrative that is going to move at a much faster pace than the Light and Dark sagas did. Removing the seasons from the game has also meant that inevitably, the seasonal story structures that gave us 1 week of story at a time are also going to go the way of the dodo. They should be gone. This means that we're likely to get more concentrated story beats in Destiny at more regular intervals. The seasonal slow progression is also gone. This has positives and negatives, don't get me wrong. For the longest time I was a massive proponent of the seasonal model, and that's because, well, I remember the content droughts, and I remembered what the alternatives felt like. It was not good. Destiny 2's annual expansions are now going to be the major point of player feedback for how the cadence of the narrative feels. That's where this point of things feeling routine is going to come into things. If the seasonal story point of the narrative being predictable comes back into focus for these expansions, it's not going to look pretty. Luckily, I think that this isn't as likely either. Bungie isn't going to be allowing all of an expansion's story to be drip-fed week by week, and as best we know, I think they understand that this isn't the right approach when it's been done for as long as it's been done. They have said, though, that there are other points they want to expand upon as they build out more expansions in the Fate saga. Bungie stated that they're going to be taking a bespoke approach to the narrative and storytelling of each expansion from here on out. Take Edge of Fate, for example. The focus of the narrative direction and how players uncover it in Edge of Fate is meant to be reminiscent of more of a Metroidvania-style approach. This means that instead of doing story beats in a progression from A to B to C to D to E, you might instead be able to go from A to D, and then from D all the way back to what would have been B, and then from B to C, and then finally to E. You can choose the missions in a different order and embrace those threads as you want. Metroidvania structures within gameplay also imply that we'll be unlocking the world more as we unlock more tools to explore it. This is probably where things like Matter Spark come in. This is just for Edge of Fate though. We have no idea what the narrative delivery of content is going to look like for Renegades, or Shattered Cycle, or The Alchemist, or whatever comes next. What we do know is that we can expect something different every time. Bungie is actively looking to experiment and try new things for each expansion. From a perspective of novelty, I think that's fantastic, and I think it feeds into the bigger 2-beat note about this conversation. I tried to find so many ways to express this, but simply put, I think this is important because for the longest time, I think we've been in this place where Destiny's seasonal stories have allowed us to become bored, settled in a place of routine. And I think that in order for this to succeed, that will be the point of friction that needs to be avoided the most. I think players need to be constantly surprised. You can't delight everyone. You can probably surprise most of them. And in the point of all of this being made, I think this is the time to take risks. This is the thing that I really had trouble trying to express, and I'm kind of ignoring the last few pages of my script by just trying to focus on this one single point that I think is the most salient of all. Bungie needs to be okay with experimenting. It needs to be okay with growing what Destiny can be as a universe, experimenting with concepts, and embracing the strange. In this landscape of gaming, where everything that is samey is being culled, I think the most important thing that Destiny can do is to embrace what has made it unique for so long, and that is how weird it is. How weird and how wonderful. Because Destiny has never been a normal universe. It's always had its quirks, and it's always had its strangeness to it. But the moments when it's felt weakest have been the moments when it's predictable and dull. It's in moments like where Eramis ended up being Beyond Light's Villain of the Week flavor antagonist. Meanwhile, take a look at Savathun, the queen of lies and deception, someone weird by design, but brilliantly portrayed, brilliantly written, and someone who by design distorts expectation. This is what Destiny should be okay with doing, because if Bungie confidently fails in a narrative experiment that people can understand as a narrative experiment, I think that's one thing. But if Bungie creates something dull and something uninteresting that players can't really latch onto, I think that would be a more unforgivable sin. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule. I think it's worth pointing out that Lightfall should be one of them, and I don't say that as a means of not couching criticism on one of Destiny's worst received expansions. I make that merely as a point of sitting there and saying that if the rumors of executive mismanagement are true, then it doesn't seem fit to punish the narrative team for that particular expansion. If it is true, we can't attribute the failures to the narrative team in the same way that we can't blame a runner for losing a race when someone shot them in the leg. Again, off topic, but it still goes back to the bigger point. Unambitious expansions in Destiny are not what we need right now. I think they need to be bold, they need to be innovative, no matter what that looks like, and they need to be weird. Anything less, something that is too routine, too predictable, too safe, I think that is what Destiny can't afford right now. It's too soon to tell whether things get better or worse for Destiny, but that excitement gives me a little more confidence whenever I see it. Of course, with that, and with all the factors that I discussed before, time will tell. Thank you very much for watching though, and I hope that this video was informative. If it was, go ahead and hit the like button, and leave your own thoughts down below in the comments section. Of course, if you want more videos from me, go ahead and hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe to turn on those email notifications. But as per usual, know that your viewership, as always, has been quite enough for me, and that in the meantime, my name is Bife. Rodacia ad Astra. I'll see you starside.